Welcome to Lynn Cullen Live. Talk radio without the static. Email your questions and comments to lynncullenshow@gmail.com. And now your host, Lynn Cullen.
And a good morning to you. It is January 16th. Excuse me, just for a minute I blanked. It's Martin Luther King Day, actually. And I do want to talk about him, the day, for a bit, if you don't mind. I think it's especially important to remember that as this Martin Luther King Day is noted, that it is occurring at the same time as states all over this country are passing laws or taking other legislative steps to limit, seriously, curtail how the teaching of racism is taught in our public schools. In some cases, in these 17 states, it essentially hamstrings teachers from teaching that racism even exists. I think it's pretty important to put this Martin Luther King Day into the context of what's going on in America right now. The 17 states I mentioned that have seriously curtailed the teaching of racism are, of course, states controlled by one of the two major parties in this country. And obviously, you know which party that is. And you know which party it is because it is a party of denial of racism. It is a party that gives succor and comfort to racists. It is a party that increasingly has made next to no effort, if any, to distance itself from out and out racists and other promulgators of hate. It is the Republican Party as it is currently constituted in the year 2023. So it's with a somewhat heavy heart that I think about the extraordinary man, Dr. Martin Luther King, who has been, I don't know if the term is right, whitewashed. I think that maybe is the right term. Whitewashed by many who appropriate his words, take them out of context, misuse them. Every time a Republican quotes him, I want to cringe. They actually take his words that somebody should be judged on the basis of their character as opposed to their color. They take that out of context all the time to support anti-affirmative action programs, to work actively against all the things that he was working toward. I came upon this and I was startled when I first saw it. It's a teacher in Philadelphia, Keziah Ridgway, and she told her class something that caught my eye because I thought, what? She said this: Martin Luther King believed in violence. And I thought, what? I mean, the whole thing was Gandhi-esque, was the power of nonviolence. But then this teacher goes on to explain her startling statement. And I find it really powerful. She says, Martin Luther King believed in violence. Shut up. He used violence to his advantage, hence his belief in it. He knew that his ideas and what he was fighting for would, in fact, elicit violence. Violence on the part of the police, violence on the part of white racists. Right? He knew that the provocation of non-violence would beget violence that would come down on him and his extraordinarily courageous followers. And she said King, knowing that the nonviolence of his movement would cause violence from the authorities and from those supporting the status quo, this would, of course, end up on the news, and Americans sitting in their living rooms watching water hoses being turned on nonviolent people, seeing dogs going after nonviolent people, that this would cause a lot of Americans, white Americans, to think. It would get their attention. It would make them question their country. And I have to say, I think that's, I mean, I don't know if you agree or disagree with her, that of course he knew that his nonviolence would create violence. And it is true, and I can attest to the truth of what this Philadelphia teacher is saying, because I was a young child, not that young. I was in grade school or middle school. And I remember seeing the news. I remember seeing the water hoses, the dogs, these extraordinarily brave people just wanting to go to school or sit at a counter. And I was stunned. I was stunned. And I remember my family in lily white, upper Midwest Green Bay. When I grew up, there was one black family in the whole town. And I had never seen this reality. And I remember one very powerful, and I probably talked about it, Passover Seder that happened at around this time. And the Passover being the holiday that celebrates the Jews getting out of slavery in Egypt. And so my father at that Seder, which I'll not forget, drew a parallel between what we were seeing on Walter Cronkite's CBS Evening News happening in our own country to what the Jews that on Passover we say we were slaves. And he pointed out that we should, because of that, understand more than most what Black people were fighting for. Anyway, I also remember, and it might have even been around the same time, I remember going to hear Governor George Wallace of Alabama speak. He came to Green Bay for whatever reason. Maybe it was when he was running for president. And I just needed to see in person this appalling human being. And I remember being stunned because he had on stage with him, he had a Black person. He had created this tableau of diversity of people who were supporting him, which is, of course, a tactic that is used to this day. But I bring him up because I had read a book review recently that about racism in America that talks quite a bit about George Wallace and how he typified the American racist and how he understood more than most that America was racist. And he felt that he could ride racism to the White House. He knew that Americans, and this is, I'm going to quote now Ralph Waldo Emerson, he knew Americans had a very strange definition of freedom. We're seeing it now. I'm talking about this now because it's so much like what we're seeing with the Republican Party now. And people who identify with this Republican Party always talking about freedom. And what they mean by freedom is so strange, so odd. Ralph Waldo Emerson. And he said this right after the Civil War. He said that Americans were fanatics in freedom. They hate tolls, taxes, turnpikes, banks, hierarchies, governors, laws. Now that sounds, what he just said, like a description of the Republican base. So don't think that these Republicans we're seeing now are some anomaly. They have been America for a long, long time. And when George Wallace took the oath of office as governor of Alabama, the speech that he was famous for when he said segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. In that speech, he used the word freedom incessantly. It came at every bullet point of that speech. Segregation now, segregation forever. Freedom, freedom, freedom. He said, I have been taught that freedom meant freedom from any threat or fear of government. Sounds exactly like the Republicans of today. And as for freedom, he said that black citizens of Alabama were free as well. Free, these are his words, free to live and toil and teach and learn within their separate racial station. So in this book review, they're talking about the fact that in America, there has always been this unholy union for hundreds and hundreds of years in this country between racism and the rabid loathing of government. And Wallace knew that what he was saying to Alabama would resonate with white Americans well beyond, which is what brought him to the whitest place, Green Bay, Wisconsin. He railed about the Civil Rights Act. He railed about the Voting Rights Act. And he rode the backlash of against the civil rights movement. And he thought he could ride it to the White House. He said this, and it shows how smart he was. Being a Southerner, he said, is no longer geographic. It's a philosophy. It's an attitude. Yeah, he's saying that white grievance is all over this country. And it is still pervasive. And it is still the primal, animating principle of Republican politics. And so, it's hardly surprising that today, if you're living in Alabama or Mississippi, or I believe Idaho, you are not celebrating Martin Luther King Day, even though it is a federal holiday. In Mississippi and in Alabama, today is called King Lee Day. Can you imagine? They take Robert E. Lee and pal him up with Dr. King. Lee, who fought to keep black people enslaved. How vile is that? And yet 2 states in this country have enshrined it as a state holiday. And yet, teaching that race is an animating reality in our nation's history, more than any other, is now forbidden in 17 states, and I'm sure the number will grow. I remember reading once why we as a country, that America is an outlier in that all other wealthy Western countries, democratic countries, have, social safety nets. Some more substantial than others, but all more substantial than ours. In terms of healthcare, in terms of education, in terms of all the sort of basic things that a lot of people would argue is the reason for government, to have a government, to make sure that the citizens were not just safe from foreign threat, which seems to be what Republicans think the only reason is for a government, but that they have access to opportunity and have a measure of equal access, right? And the reason that America is the outlier, the reason it doesn't have national health insurance, the reason it doesn't help working families or families with children, the reason it seemingly turns, you have an entire party, Republican Party, who can't say no quickly enough to anything that will give any help to the least of us. And the reason is racism. The reason is Americans, big hunk of them, white America, is quite willing to not have those protections itself. If it means that Black people would get them too. The idea that this would be available to all Americans, Black and white, means that a whole bunch of white America says, never mind. They'll cut off their noses to spite their face. Incredible. And I, once seeing that explanation for why we are the outlier, it rang so true. Gotta be behind it. This extraordinary animus, this racism. So I saw that one of the last speeches Dr. King gave, this one is actually a sermon that he gave 4 days before his death. And he talked about the fact that, it's one thing to let people out of their slavery chains, but it's quite another to just unlock those chains and leave those people to fend for themselves. After they had secured through their labor nothing, their labor had done what? Had created wealth for white people. They got none of it. And so Dr. King said this in that sermon. He said in 1863, the Negro was told that he was free as a result of the Emancipation Proclamation being signed by Abraham Lincoln. But he was not given any land to make that freedom meaningful. And he went on to note that at the same time, the American government was giving land to white people. Millions and millions of acres of land were being opened in the Midwest and West to white people, right? Who would farm it. And King goes on. And not only did the government give land to these people, it built land grant colleges to teach them and their children, to teach them how to farm. Not only that, it provided county agents to further their expertise in farming. And not only that, as the years unfolded, it provided low interest rates so they could mechanize their farms. And on this day, thousands of these very persons and their descendants are receiving millions of dollars in federal subsidies every year, not to farm that land. That is what the government's willing to do if it's white folks. So the reason Republicans don't want to talk about racism, don't want their children taught about racism, are clearly and quite transparently trying to erase this country's history. Because if we face it, if we know it, we come back to the uncomfortable truth that we owe Black people in this country. We owe them big time. You know, a racist will say, hey, we let the slaves go. Bang, bang, bang. That's it. Huh? No mention of what King talks about here. You let them go, like go forth. No clothes on your back, no shoes on your feet, no land, no anything, not a shred of anything of value other than your own ability to, again, labor. So you eliminate this from our history lessons, and then we don't end up in that uncomfortable position, right? We don't end up having to think. Esau Macaulay, who is a New Testament professor, said this, that King's words reminds us that injustice leaves a legacy. It creates inequalities that do not simply disappear. And people of goodwill need to use that knowledge to work toward and establish something like justice I don't know. Okay. And speaking of hate in America, I saw, I think, last week I got something that I couldn't open during the show from one of you guys, and I think I know now what it was, but I still haven't seen anything much about it except for the one publication in town that covers uncomfortable realities, and that would be Pittsburgh City Paper. And that is where I saw the story about the billboard in Butler County. Are you aware of this? I guess if you watch local TV news, surely they've covered it. Surely they've covered it, right? I don't know why I've seen nothing in the PG, not that I should even be looking at it, but there is a billboard right there on the highway. And it's one of those billboards that changes, so it's a fancy dancy new billboard. I'm looking at a screenshot of one of the signs that show up on this billboard, and it says this: whites are under attack. Stop teaching critical racist theory to our kids. Stop it now. When the billboard decides it's time for another wonderful, uplifting kind of a message, it shows you a swastika. Mm-hmm. Now, it says, let me see some of the other things. It has a swastika along with the message, FBI corrupt and dangerous. The Gestapo. Here's another one that shows up on this billboard. God's law, marriage, one man, one woman. Another, God prohibits same-sex marriage. Now, I have to tell you, in all my 75 plus years of life, I have never seen a swastika on an electronic billboard on a highway very close to where I live, saying whites are under attack. Now, the thing is that this messaging over there in Trumpville puts people at risk. And we know who those people are. Black people, gay people, trans people, Jewish people, any people who aren't white, Christian people. And this, too, is the result of an ethno-nationalist, neo-fascist party called the Republican Party. It is in no way anything else. Now we got this pesky thing called the First Amendment. I don't know that anything can be done about this. There is, of course, a hue and cry about it. And you can argue, as did the communications director for the Jewish Federation of Greater Pittsburgh, she says, there is a difference between free speech and hate speech. because hate speech incites violence and creates a threat to the community. And any extremist symbols, such as Nazi paraphernalia and the messages that are paired with it, can be a precursor to violence. She went on to say Western Pennsylvania specifically has a significant portion of white supremacist and extremist groups that are known and identified. And this just confirms their presence. Wow. Well, the thing is, these freedoms and how we perceive them have always been, different for different people. Right? There was an obit today that I noted that brings up the same kind of an issue. A guy named Alfred Goodwin died at the age of 99, and I never heard of him, and I didn't know anything about him, but you know me, I read obits. And turns out this is a judge, federal judge, who was appointed to the federal judiciary by Richard Nixon, but who became infamous for being part of a decision that struck down the Pledge of Allegiance being recited in public schools. Oh, man. Yeah. Alfred Goodwin. Do you imagine back in the day a Republican president like Richard Nixon could appoint a judge who said this, the Pledge of Allegiance is unconstitutional, and said this: the words "under God" in the pledge are as objectionable as if we said "under Jesus" or "under Vishnu" or "under Zeus" or "a nation under no God." It's all the same. He said it was suggesting that the state endorsed not a specific religion, but the state is endorsing belief in monotheism, in a religious belief. One nation under God. Now, the case was brought by a man who had a daughter in school, and he said it was, she shouldn't have to recite that or be singled out if she doesn't recite it. And of course, when this decision came out, all hell broke loose. Republicans and Democrats alike, Tom Daschle at the time, Democrat, said, this decision is just nuts. And so the Senate immediately passed a resolution reaffirming the Pledge of Allegiance as written. The vote, 99 to nothing in the Senate. So, yeah, nobody in a political position was willing to acknowledge the truth of the ruling of Alfred Goodwin. And he didn't care. He said this: I never had much confidence in the attention span of elected officials for any kind of deep thinking about important issues. When they pop off after some bumper sticker headline, they almost always give a superficial response. Well, you can't argue with them there. Anyway, 4 years later, this thing gets to the Supreme Court. I don't know why it took it so long. See, in this day and age, it would have been there the next day because we have an extraordinarily activist court. And the United States Supreme Court, by a vote of 5-3, said it's okay to have under God in the pledge. Well, they didn't really say that. On a vote 5-3, they overturned the ruling, but not because of what Judge Goodwin had said about under God obviously being state sponsorship of religious belief. The Supreme Court did what courts often do. It sidestepped the issue and said that the father who had brought the case in the first place, the father whose daughter was having to say the pledge, that he lacked standing to bring the case. And so it was overturned. But the court did not rule on the constitutional issue of whether one nation under God runs counter to what our Constitution says about the state not endorsing religion. Alfred Goodwin. I came upon this, and I must say I often find that the magazine called The Week, mostly when I get it, because I pay attention to the news, I know. I said, ripping through the pages, but there's always a little something that pops up here or there that I didn't see. And one of the things I wouldn't have seen is there's always an editor's letter on page 3, usually written by the managing editor, but sometimes a few other people in editorial positions. And man, they're often so good. Good in that they educate me. And I want to read a little bit of this one to you because I learned from it. I mean, I thought it was so well done. Some of what we're hearing about what the Republicans now in control in the House, some of the rules they're just throwing overboard, some of the new rules they're putting forward. What's the impact of these things? You hear about this rule, that rule, and you think, I don't really, not enough of a news junkie to quite follow all this. But let me give you this little lesson because I found it fascinating. It tells us why we are in for, what we're in for. This is by Mark Gimian. Roughly 2 decades ago, the Republican Party cemented the practice of never bringing any legislation to the floor of the House unless it was supported by the majority of the majority. Now, stop and think about that. That means you don't bring anything to the House until you know it's going to pass. This was in a Republican-controlled House when Dennis Hastert, it was called the Hastert Rule. He went on, of course, to go to jail for pedophilia, did he not? And stop and think what that does. I mean, it is. I'll go back to. So the Hastert Rule: you can't bring anything to the House floor unless you know it's going to pass. It has to have a majority of the majority. It essentially quashed any bipartisan legislation that was not endorsed then by Dennis Hastert, by the House leadership. So this started, it helped to start the incredible polarization of Congress. I mean, what are the Democrats doing there? Nothing. No reason for them to even show up. But cut to today. Now you have another Republican, I use the word control, maybe a Republican-controlled Congress that is now going to operate under a new rule, not the Hastert rule. This new Congress's rule is that it's the minority of the minority can now have extraordinary power. Nothing will happen in this House unless it gains the backing of the most extreme, and they say, frankly, unhinged faction of the majority party. So while people used to decry the power of the House Speaker under the Hastert rule to strangle new ideas in the crib, this Congress will likely look back on that wistfully. Because instead of an overly strict teacher running the class is getting handed over to the bullies in the back row. I thought that was a really good explanation of what McCarthy gave to the bullies. He gave them control. And this guy goes on to say, and what do the bullies, what are they going to do with this power? And he said, what a stupid question. They have no plans to do anything except create chaos. It's going to be a long, long 2 years. Oh, God. Okay. I suppose this isn't going to mean anything to some of you because you're not as old as me, but Gina Lollobrigida has died. Now, I have to tell you, I think one of the reasons she lives in my head is mostly because of the sound of her name. I just love Gina Lollobrigida. I mean, how can you have a better name than that? And she was extremely beautiful, shapely human being. She was gorgeous. And she was a big star in Italy and then started in some American films and became a pretty big star over here. Gina Lollobrigida. She was 95. Some of the films that you may have seen her in, she in Trapeze with Burt Lancaster and Tony Curtis. She played Esmeralda in Casablanca, in Hunchback of Notre Dame. Anyway, she was out there, and what I didn't know about her, and this is interesting. She became, a lot of people thought she was the most beautiful woman, the most beautiful actress in the world. She was pretty. She was, as you find out later, a very serious thinker and had a much broader range of skills and interests than, simply, looking like the babe that she was. She wrote, directed, and produced a documentary about Fidel Castro. And it was based mostly on her own interview with Castro, who I'm sure was very happy to sit down with her. That was shown at the 1975 Berlin Film Festival. She was also a sculptor and had exhibitions. She ran for the European Parliament in 1999. She did not get elected. But still, wow. Gina Lollobrigida. Pretty incredible. She also was outspoken about, she said she knew that women pretended to be stupid in front of men. I once was so startled. I was with friends. I remember exactly where I was, at a house on the south side. This had to be like late 80s. And the women I was with, I won't name names, although you would know some of them, were highly successful people and would go on to be more and more successful people. None of us at the time were married. And we had this discussion. And I remember being just stunned because all the other women, and these were some smart cookies, all of them said that they had dumbed down in front of a man that they, were interested in. All of them copped to pretending they weren't as bright as they were for fear the man would get away, be intimidated. And I remember them sort of hotly arguing with me when I expressed astonishment at that. I've never forgotten it. Never forgotten it. But see, Gina Lollobrigida, she knew about it. But she didn't have any problem people looking at her and saying, hey, whoa. She said, why should I be offended if somebody tells me I have a beautiful body? It's not an insult. That's true. It's not. But if they fail to acknowledge the other aspects of your being, that would be. But no, she was more a thinker than she lived in her head more than in that beautiful body. And as she aged, she said, success, it goes up and then it goes down. She says, I've been hungry. I've been rich. Life changes. Now I'm not rich, but I still have my mind. And I think that means you're rich. I was thinking I would be perfectly happy existing, I think, as just a head. If you could cut my body off me and I would just be a head, first of all, I would lose a lot of pain right off the bat. And I was thinking, I think most of the pleasure that I've enjoyed in my life has not come because of my body. It's come because of my mind. Don't you think? I mean, I would much rather, idea of losing my mind is so much more frightening to me than losing my body. But I know. So, I'm wondering if I need to hang on here, guys. UFOs. Are you aware that anything you want to know, you're going to know about what the government knows? It turns out that in the defense bill that was passed, the National Defense Authorization Act, where they throw gazillions of dollars at the Defense Department, there was this little amendment that was tucked into it that requires the Department of Defense to review all historical documents related to unidentified flying objects, aerial phenomena, and since 1945. And they went back to 1945 because that's the year that an avocado-shaped object struck a communication tower in the New Mexico desert, where the world's first atomic bomb was detonated that July, called the Trinity site. So they want to go back there. Roswell was later. Roswell happened in 47. And this, because now the Defense Department is mandated to look into this stuff, to report on it. In fact, last year, the Defense Department already established an office which goes back, and they deliver reports. So every once in a while you do see something. And just the other day, they had a report out. I think it was Thursday, that they came out with the most recent report. And it said, and this report was released by the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. And it said that there were 366 incidents of either observed or submitted since their last report in 2021. So 366 sightings since 2021. And of those sightings, 26 were found upon investigation to have been drones. 163 turned out to be balloons. And 6 were considered to be airborne clutter, which could be a mass of birds or space junk. And the remaining, that left 171 that still don't have a reason or an explanation. And it said some of those will that demonstrated unusual flight characteristics will be looked at further. I don't know. Turns out that a lot of them, by the way, are surveillance operations by foreign powers. And I don't think they say much about that, since we're doing that too someplace else. But they no longer poo-poo or laugh at or wave off people who are curious and consider finding out about these aerial phenomena to be, lunatics. They don't. So you've got, major brass in the Defense Department now. Actually, here's the head of the Pentagon task force that examines all the unexplained sightings. He was answering a question about, has there been any evidence of any kind of alien life with any of these? And he says, they don't say, I get the hell. He says, at this time, the answer is no. At this time, the answer is no. We have nothing. We have seen nothing that would lead us to believe that any of the objects that we have seen are of alien origin. So, for all you UFO folks, these are good times, because you're going to have access to a lot of information that was not available before. Pretty cool. Okie doke. I think that's it for me. I thank you very much for joining me, and I'll be back tomorrow, and Susan should be joining us. Okay? Have a good one. Enjoy this sun. I hope it lasts. Bye.
Lynn Cullen Live, Monday through Thursday from 10 a.m. to 11 a.m. and archived at pghcitypaper.com. The opinions expressed on Lynn Cullen Live are those of the host and do not necessarily reflect the viewpoints of Pittsburgh City Paper or its advertisers.